My administration is 100% committed to eradicating human trafficking from the earth.
A massive international sex trafficking ring is busted.
Suspects face a long list of charges, including promoting prostitution, unlawful imprisonment, and criminal content.
Also, child endangerment.
4:30 a.m. A civilian ICE employee built a prostitution network in Minneapolis. A Republican state senator was tied into a hundreds of millions of dollars ring. 29 minors listed in a trafficking roster vanished without a trace. 2.1 tons of drugs were quietly smuggled into the United States through this system. Do you want to know the truth they tried to bury? Hit like, and I'll expose it all. At 4:30 a.m., Bloomington, a quiet suburb just south of Minneapolis, looked exactly like what older Americans still remember. Empty streets, fresh snow covering the sidewalks, porch lights glowing softly, and a silence that usually means safety. But that morning, the silence didn't feel safe. It was a cover. In the darkness, more than 20 dark federal SUVs moved with no sirens, no lights, no warning. Doors didn't slam. Radios were kept low. In just minutes, over 120 federal agents took positions across a carefully mapped zone. Not for drugs, not for weapons, for children. This operation had a name that made every briefing room go cold. Operation Creep, a coordinated undercover action between the FBI and ICE, designed to target men suspected of trying to buy sex from minors and to expose the underground network that enables those crimes. For nearly 2 months, task forces built case files, tracked patterns, and monitored communications that investigators described as too coordinated to be random. Analysts flagged repeating contact points across the metro area, the same coded language, the same schedule, the same location route. By the time agents finalized the plan, the evidence pointed to something horrifying, a demand pipeline strong enough to draw in dozens of buyers, even in a community filled with churches, schools, and families. In Bloomington alone, investigators identified 16 men linked to suspected plots to meet minors for paid sex. The most shocking name on that list was Alexander Stephen Back, 41, a civilian employee of ICE caught inside the sting, a federal government insider appearing in a federal investigative file connected to exploitation and trafficking. But inside the task force, that wasn't even the most frightening number. The accurate headline number was 29. That was the projected number of potential young victims connected to the wider trafficking pipeline, a number large enough to fill an entire classroom, large enough to ignite a scandal that could shake Minnesota to its core. And what stunned seasoned agents most was this. This wasn't an old case. This wasn't the past, a century that claims to condemn exploitation, an era of cameras, smartphones, and constant surveillance. And yet the most brutal crimes are still arranged in secrecy, hidden behind ordinary lives. Before sunrise, teams carried out targeted checks at critical locations. A suburban home where Back's activity was linked to the broader network was placed under tight surveillance. Agents approached silently, secured the entry, and began a systematic search for digital devices, transaction records, and traces of communication. Because in operations like this, the truth rarely hides out on the street. It hides behind normal doors. Press like and subscribe to follow the truth behind the chilling question: why are the very people entrusted to uphold federal law getting tied to a prostitution network that shakes national trust? The early morning raid in Bloomington was not random. It was a staging ground. A trap had already been set. And as the first rays of sunlight rose over the quiet rooftops, federal investigators were no longer waiting for rumors or anonymous tips. They were waiting for evidence. This operation carried a name that sounded harmless on paperwork, but terrifying in reality: supply. And today's central figure was Bella, a 17-year-old girl still legally a minor. To the outside world, she looked like just another face on a screen. But to investigators, she represented something far darker. One of 29 young victims believed to be connected to a larger trafficking pipeline, one that intelligence suggested was being prepared for a major surge toward the end of the year. She wasn't chosen because she stood out. She was chosen because she could disappear. And investigators believed Alexander Stephen Back was not acting alone. They suspected he had deeper connections, an insider position to help move victims through a much wider network. As Back's vehicle entered the staging zone, surveillance teams tracked every turn, every slowdown, every stop, preparing for the final phase. But then agents saw something that changed everything. He didn't arrive as a lone supplier. He moved with protection, not obvious bodyguards, not uniforms, a shadow layer, silent operational infrastructure designed to keep the network stable. 3 other names emerged as key links, not the final bosses, but the machine that makes exploitation run smoothly. Sassinarine Gamandi, 52, Prior Lake, connected to facilitation routes and communication channels that appeared to coordinate introductions and movement. Emmanuel Lopez, 29, Bloomington, tied to logistics patterns investigators described as active planning behavior, suggesting direct operational involvement. Nicholas Daniel Scheitberger, 36, Minneapolis, linked to contact nodes repeatedly appearing at the center of high-frequency message chains. No single name explained the entire operation, but combined, they formed a chilling picture. Support roles, the kind of people who keep the machine running while others absorb the obvious risk. Investigators also believe this same structure helped move 2.1 tons of narcotics into the United States through trafficking-linked transactions. Investigators identified communication patterns consistent with known trafficking behavior: repeated short texts, coded language, location pings sent minutes apart, and time-stamped confirmations, signs of an intermediary layer, organizers who manage crime while keeping their identities protected. At the predetermined location, he showed up intending to finalize what investigators estimated as a $6.8 million transaction. That's when the trap slammed shut. Agents surged in, federal commands echoing through the morning air. "Federal agents, hands up!" Within seconds, Back was restrained. His phone was seized immediately because in investigations like this, a phone isn't just evidence. It's a map. It holds the contacts, usernames, apps, deleted conversations, hidden folders, and digital traces that can lead to victims who were never supposed to be found. But inside the interrogation room, as federal analysts traced connections and cross-matched identities, one conclusion hardened fast. Back was not the center. He was the surface, a visible piece, not the real engine. And as the digital evidence expanded, the scope of the case expanded with it, from a single sting into something far larger. Then came the most shocking realization. Bloomington wasn't the hub. It was the beginning. And the next target would not be another buyer. It would be the powerful figure inside the government machine believed to be sitting behind the entire operation. Comment exposed, and I'll tell you the name. The figure America has praised in multiple major operations. And behind that phrase was a name with real political weight. Justin Eichorn, 41 years old, former Minnesota State Senator, Republican. To many Minnesotans, that name did not represent the underworld, it represented the legislature. Not crime, but government. Not exploitation, but respectability. A man who once stood in public spaces, shook hands, posed for photos, and spoke in the language of values. That contrast wasn't just irony, it was disgusting. Because in a later internal federal assessment, the allegation was blunt. Eichorn wasn't merely someone close to the operation. He was suspected of being a coordinating figure, positioned high enough to direct others, exert influence to keep people silent, and keep the entire machine running. Superiors didn't rush. In cases involving public officials, speed is never the #1 priority. Evidence is. Within just a few days, federal task forces escalated the operation to a higher level, targeted search warrants, coordinated breach planning, and high-security evidence collection procedures. Agents prepared for a moment that could reshape the entire investigation, and then the task force moved. At 6:14 a.m., a convoy of unmarked vehicles advanced toward the suspect's residence. No sirens, no shouting. A precise approach because surprise was the only advantage they had. Federal agents established a security perimeter in under 90 seconds, locking down exits, blocking the driveway, and cutting off all movement. Nobody wanted a show. They wanted the truth. The lead team approached a private home linked to the former senator, a house that looked completely ordinary from the outside. The kind of home you could pass 1,000 times without noticing. Then the door opened. Agents executed the warrant and began what investigators called a full search. Not chaotic, not rushed, but highly methodical. Room by room, shelf by shelf, not searching for drama. They were searching for records. In the first hour, digital forensics units seized multiple electronic devices. Financial investigators began documenting potential asset trails. Every item was tagged, photographed, and sealed. And if this network truly involved 29 exploited minors, then even one missed phone or one hidden hard drive could mean another victim still unidentified. But then the search moved into a more serious phase. Not just devices, product. Inside a concealed compartment carefully disguised within the garage, agents discovered sealed bags holding tens of thousands of pills, packaged like pharmaceuticals, but suspected by investigators to be synthetic narcotics. Small, uniform, easy to transport, easy to distribute. The kind of product that can move across state lines overnight without anyone noticing. And with it came evidence of money flow. An estimated $79 million in cash, packed into 3 suitcases, labeled as a new transaction. But what froze experienced agents wasn't the amount, it was how the money moved. Because what was recovered in the records, from messages and transaction codes to transfer tracking sheets, revealed a laundering route running across 3 continents: North America, Europe, Asia/the Middle East, ending at final destination points where the money was legitimized through investments, real estate, and fake service contracts. Inside the evidence boxes, the case kept expanding. Not because of what was loud, but because of what was organized. Investigators described the structure as a revenue model, not random criminal behavior. Conservative projections suggested the underground operation may have generated hundreds of millions of dollars through recruitment, scheduling, contraband movement, and a complex buyer network. Money that large doesn't appear by accident. It moves through systems, through pipelines, through intermediaries, and that can only exist if there is leadership. And as that reality took shape, the meaning of Operation Creep changed. The point was no longer just arresting the men who showed up. The point was exposing a machine powerful enough to hide behind status, behind titles, and behind the illusion that leadership does not belong in investigations like this. As night fell, the most disturbing truth was no longer a theory. It was a conclusion. If a former senator could sit behind the scenes of a network like this, then the problem isn't individual, it's embedded from within. By nightfall, Minnesota was no longer dealing with a police operation. It was dealing with a crisis of trust. The raid on a former state senator's home didn't just elevate the case, it detonated it. Because once federal agents crossed that line, the public could no longer pretend this was just a few sick men. The pattern was too consistent, the evidence too organized, the names too connected. And the most terrifying truth was simple. This wasn't happening in the past. This was happening in 2025, in a century of cameras, warnings, background checks, and public outrage. Yet the predators didn't disappear. They evolved. Investigators described the system as a pipeline that used the modern world against itself. It didn't rely on street corners. It relied on screens, on coded phrases, on private messages that vanish in seconds, on burner numbers registered under fake identities, and on arranged meetups placed in normal locations. Parking lots, hotel corridors, quiet roads, where no one would ask questions. For older Americans, this was a new kind of danger because it looked like nothing. A phone lights up, a message arrives, a meeting is scheduled, and an adult, someone's neighbor, coworker, even someone connected to enforcement, shows up. No warning signs, no loud violence, just silence and choice. Operation Creep had already proven one thing. 16 men were willing to take that step. But the deeper evidence, now under review, suggested something worse than individual guilt. It suggested organization. Federal analysts began compiling a broader map using digital forensics and cross-referenced identifiers. They weren't just counting suspects anymore. They were counting potential victims. And as the scope expanded, investigators worked under an assumption that made the room go quiet. The 29 minors linked to the suspected pipeline might not represent the full number. They might represent only the number the task force could see, because that is how networks survive, by keeping the real scale hidden behind paperwork, deniability, and reasonable explanations. In the modern age, criminals don't always hide from the law. Sometimes they hide inside normal life. And then came the hardest part for the agents involved, the part that no seizure photo can capture. Victim support teams began coordinating emergency protocols, medical screening, safe placements, trauma response, long-term counseling referrals. These are not quick fixes. These are years of repair. And for investigators with 20 or 30 years in service, many of them fathers and grandfathers, the emotional toll was visible. One federal source described the mood as heavy. Another said, this wasn't a case. It was a moral injury. Because the question wasn't just how many victims were harmed, it was how many adults looked the other way. As public attention increased, federal command moved into a damage control posture, not to protect reputations, but to protect evidence. Every device seized was treated like a live battlefield asset. Chain of custody paperwork was double-logged. Digital images were cloned, communications were compartmentalized. When the investigation touches power, the task force assumes the same rule every veteran learns. The truth has enemies. For the citizens of Minnesota, especially those over 60, people who remember when communities felt smaller and safer, the realization hit like ice water. If this could happen in Bloomington, if it could reach Minneapolis, if it could touch a former senator, then no neighborhood was too quiet, no title was too clean, no era was too modern. And as investigators prepared their next wave of subpoenas and interviews, one warning circulated through federal channels with brutal clarity. This case would not end with arrests, because what Operation Creep exposed was not only crime, it was a system that learned how to hide the unthinkable inside normal life, and a generation that never imagined they would see it in their own backyard.